The Word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, and piercing as far as the division of the soul and the spirit, of both joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. We believe all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. The Bible tells us to study, to show yourself approved unto God, a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. As always, we assemble together to fulfill the royal imperative of 2 Peter 3:18, to grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And those of you who showed up this morning have also fulfilled the mandate of Hebrews 10:25, to not forsake the assembling of yourselves, as the manner of some is. Well, as I said earlier, we are studying the book of Zechariah. We're in the 8th vision that begins in chapter 6. And in the 8th vision, he begins in a narrative where he says, "Then I lifted up my eyes again, and I looked, and behold, 4 chariots were coming forth from between the 2 mountains." Notice here in the Hebrew we have an article here with the mountains. These are specific mountains that he's identified. He also identifies them as mountains of bronze. And the mountains were bronze mountains, he said. These are particular mountains that he sees in this vision. Although many people have tried to identify them and say that they're Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, the Mount of Olives, whatever mountains these may be, we have to understand that this is a vision. These are things that he's seeing in the vision. Of course, we do know that Zechariah, his position has been in the ravine, a familiar place to the people locally in Jerusalem, just outside the city. This is where he first saw a man riding on a red horse. And then he saw the man among the myrtle trees. And it's almost like when we come to the 8th vision, we've made a cycle, that we've put a bookend on this particular part of the visions, because we've started out where there were other horses along with this man, and they were sent on a patrol. And now we have something very similar to that again. Well, in verses 2 and 3, Zechariah said, "With the first chariot were red horses, with the second chariot black horses, and with the third chariot white horses, and with the fourth chariot strong dappled horses." Notice that there is a difference in the color of these horses, and that being the strong dappled horses as opposed to what were called sorrel horses in the first vision. And of course he said that they're drawing chariots behind them. Well, this is something that we haven't seen before. And of course, when we think about these things and people see that number 4, of course they say, well, these are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These are 4 chariots. This is all, there's all kinds of stuff. People jump to all kinds of conclusions before they even get the explanation that this speaking angel, the interpreting angel, gives to Zechariah. Well, in the narrative of the 8th vision, Zechariah described these 4 chariots, they're mobile vehicles. He did this with a substantive. He said that these 4 chariots, he said those ones, those that are coming forth. So they're coming forth, coming towards him in a certain way, if you will, moving out. And of course, when you think of chariots moving out, in that particular time of day, you might think, well, these could be government chariots. These could be sent out for some particular reason, possibly on a mission. But they're coming forth. And of course, this is the same language he used when he talked about the Apha and the cursed and the winged women, that they're coming forth, using that Hebrew verb yatsah. So we know that they're moving in this particular vision. Well, Zechariah, of course, he saw 2 more objects in this vision. These mountains that he described are mountains of bronze, bronze mountains. They're dark mountains. And of course, A lot of people say, well, they're probably just some mountains, and it's dark outside and they look bronze, and there's certain things that they could look at. But there was mountains in Jerusalem in various locations where, there was ore. Yes, mineral ore in these mountains. This is something that's even told to the people before they entered the Promised Land, describing what was there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But in general, when you talk about chariots, most often they're used for military contests, training, and whatever they might be used for. But sometimes they're used in funeral processions, in parades, and peace missions. But during great times of power, historically, we know that God provided prosperity for nations, whether it was Israel or some other nation. As we know, God raises up nations and he takes them down. But during those times of prosperity, there were armies that enjoyed the possession and use of chariots. Some of them tremendous numbers of chariots, in the hundreds. And of course, we talked about how Solomon had made a deal on Egyptian chariots. For, he bought a bunch of chariots for a couple $1 million. In today's standards, 840,000 shekels. But picking up today, on page 242 of your notes at point 19, for the powerful and wealthy rulers of nations and kingdoms, the use of a chariot was standard transportation, even for simple errands or on occasion to meet with one's family. And of course, you can imagine how this might be, and it might have been kind of like ancient time limo. Bring me a chariot. They bring a chariot, and they've got a driver there, and the ruler, the king, the commander, whoever it is, steps on board and takes them where they want to go. It's something that's fairly simple, I guess you could say, in that day and time. But when we look to Genesis chapter 46 and verse 29 as an example of this, we know that Joseph, he was given privileges by the Pharaoh. And there was a time whenever he decided that he needed to go and speak to his father, who he'd moved into the land. And of course, his father was dying. Genesis chapter 46 and verse 29. And here it says, Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. And of course, then Israel, who we know as Jacob, said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you're still alive. Well, he just took a nice, easy ride to the land of Goshen there in a chariot and was able to see Israel. Point 20, however, most of the time chariots were considered to be mobile weapons that could be used in warfare if the battlefield was on fairly even ground. And you can imagine if you're not on very even ground, the chariot's not going to work very good. It'll be bouncing around all over the place, and who knows what happens from there. But some of the ancient armies, as I said earlier, deployed huge chariot forces. And we see this, evidence of this back in Judges chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Judges chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And of course we have the usual thing going on. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. Ehud was a good judge, kept things straightened out for quite a while. Verse 2, and the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, and the commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. The sons of Israel cried to the Lord, For he had 900 iron chariots, and he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. Can you imagine that? Iron chariots. Chariots made from iron. I'll bet those things were heavy. Yeah. There wasn't much chance if you got run over by one of those that you would come away unharmed. Let's also look at Judges chapter 10. Judges chapter 10 and verse 40. Have I got that on there wrongly? Yeah. I don't know what I did there, but anyway. Well, anyway, let's skip that one for now. Sorry about that. Point 21, in ancient times, most chariots, of course, were two-wheeled carts pulled by at least two horses. And they were not only designed for maneuverability and speed, but also to hold and protect a driver and one or two soldiers or archers. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 22 and verses 5 through 7. And here, talking about the vengeance of the Lord, for the Lord God of hosts has a day of panic, subjugation and confusion in the valley of vision, a breaking down of walls and a crying to the mountain. Elam took up the quiver with chariots, infantry, and horsemen, and Kir uncovered the shield. He said, then your choicest valleys were full of chariots, and the horsemen took up fixed positions at the gates. So you can see God's talking about certain things that happened to these people. And of course, these chariots came in. Chariots, of course, like I said, were used by kings and their kingdoms in times of prosperity when God would raise them up to, of course, to do his will. Now, we think about this kind of thing, as I've said before, I want to stimulate you mentally, spiritually, and of course, visually. So whenever we think about, such things as chariots, and of course all of you say, well, I know what a chariot looks like. I seen one going down the road the other day, right? No, you didn't. But anyway, just as a brief reminder, if you will, you might, think of a chariot and you have soldiers on board in that day and time, and they may have looked something like this. And of course, you remember in the movies like I talked about the other night, you got Ben-Hur, and they had as many as 4 horses. Pulling the chariot along, if you will. And of course they had competitions and things like that, training that they went through back in the day and time. Point 22, like Haggai's book and the historical records of other prophets, the image of multiple chariots typically represents powerful government or mobile military forces on the move. They're on the move. Well, let's take a moment and look at Isaiah again. Back to Isaiah chapter 5, verses 26 through 28. And here it says, he will also lift up a standard to the distant nation, and will whistle for it from the ends of the earth. And behold, it will come with speed swiftly. No one in it is weary or stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps, nor is the belt at its waist undone, nor its sandal strap broken. Its arrows are sharp, and all its bows are bent. The hoofs of its horses seem like flint, and its chariot wheels like a whirlwind. So here they come, and they're coming fast, they're hard, they're ready to inflict punishment. Let's also look at Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51, verses 19 through 21. And here, Jeremiah says, the portion of Jacob is not like these, for the maker of all is he, and the tribe of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name. He says, you are my war club, speaking of Jacob, my weapon of war, and with you I shatter nations, and with you I destroy kingdoms. With you I shatter the horse and his rider, and with you I shatter the chariot and its rider. So you can see the thing goes both ways. God can use these things just as well as nations can. Point 23, according to Zechariah, he saw 4 chariots coming forth, which may indicate that they were in some kind of a military formation, moving out from between the 2 mountains, possibly on a mission to confront an opposing force. This is something that, we don't know. We could speculate all day, but as we move along into the chapter, we'll find out what's going on. Well, the frequent use of the Hebrew verb yatsah, come forth, in Zechariah's vision seems to express an increase in activity related to the Lord's judgment or iniquity, idolatry, unrighteousness, and wickedness. We've seen these things moving out, things moving against unrighteousness. And of course, it's the Lord's judgment here that's moving in certain ways. Point 25, the 4 chariots are war chariots, set apart to patrol the earth and execute God's wrath among the nations at rest, who believe they will not suffer consequences for their excessive violence against his people. Now you remember back in Haggai chapter 2, verses 21 and 22. Haggai chapter 2, verses 21 and 22. And in this particular prophetic episode, the Lord was speaking through Haggai, and he said, speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overthrow the thrones of kingdoms and destroy the powers of the kingdoms of the nations. And I will overthrow the chariots and their riders, and the horses and their riders will go down, every one by the sword of another. That's one of the things whenever you think about what he's saying here, and you think about these chariots, and you think about what it would take to maintain a fleet of chariots and horsemen and soldiers and army, these have to be prosperous nations, big kingdoms, if you will. Oftentimes people think about, well, what would you think about chariots today? What kind of a form, would those be? And some people say, well, we've got tanks these days that carry men. They're like a chariot. And some of these tanks will do like 45, 50 miles an hour. They come in quick and rapid. They can do a lot of damage. There's a lot of things that you could actually consider. Some people say, well, maybe a Humvee, Well, like I said, you can speculate on these things quite often. But if we go back to Zechariah chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, you remember what the Lord said. And what was said between Zechariah and the speaking angel. So the angel who was speaking with me said to me, proclaim, saying, thus says the Lord of hosts, I am exceedingly jealous for Jerusalem and Zion, the nations who are at ease. For while I was only a little angry, he said, they furthered the disaster. So this is another way to confirm what's said here. Another way that the Lord shows his anger and his wrath towards these nations. Also, looking to Zechariah chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. A few verses down in the chapter. And here he says, when the strong ones went out, they were eager to go to patrol the earth. And he said, go, patrol the earth. So they patrolled the earth. Then he cried out to me and spoke to me, saying, see, those who are going to the land of the north have appeased my wrath in the land of the north. So these chariots, they don't represent these world powers. See, they're carrying out God's wrath, taking care of these nations who exercised evil oppression on his people. Point 26, some Bible scholars believe the prepositional phrase, me bain, from between, is indicative of a valley, like the valley of Jehoshaphat, between Mount Moriah and all of it, or the Tyropian Valley between Mount Zion and Moriah. Well, when we consider these things, and we want to talk about how this is just an artist's conception here of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's in the center, built on all these particular mountains, on Mount Zion. And of course, you can see there that we have Moriah, and we have Acra and Bezetha, and of course we have the Mount of Olives on the right. Well, you have the Tyropian Valley that goes right down through the middle of Jerusalem between Zion and Moriah. The Valley of Jehoshaphat, of course, between Moriah and the Mount of Olives. And then, of course, you have the Kidron Valley between Mount Zion and other mountains in Judea. So when we look at this, there's possibilities here that we could be talking about one of these locations. But, of course, you have to remember, this is a vision. This is a vision. Point 27, these scholars interpret the Hebrew Shnei Harim to be two literal specific mountains in the area around or near the city of Jerusalem. But these images are clearly objects that he, Zechariah, saw in the vision revealed to him by the Lord. So that's one of the things, we can't get too concerned about geographical markers unless they are particularly pointed out, or cities, or any particular location. Point 28, however, these mountains are all mentioned in the scriptures by name on more than one occasion, so why not here in our verse? He just said two bronze mountains. He could have said Zion. He could have said Moriah. He's talked about Zion before. Remember when he said, you flee, flee, you daughter of Zion. Flee from Babylon. So, anyway, he could have said something. Well, because, again, this is an image inside a prophetic vision. Point 29, in the Old Testament, mountains can be interpreted in four ways. Mountains that are established by the Lord, who is greater than the mountains. And of course, this is something that we have to keep in mind, all the time, that the Lord made the mountains. He's greater than these mountains. And of course, the Psalms attest to that particular fact in Psalm 65 and verse 6. Psalm 65 and verse 6. This is the Psalm of David. And he's been in and around those mountains many times. And of course, he says here of the Lord, who establishes the mountains by his strength, being girded with might. So these are mountains. Of course, when you talk about this, you can see that these are something physical that he's talking about, physical mountains in this particular sense. Point B, mountains are a symbol of power or an obstacle. Now, if we look at Jeremiah chapter 51 again, Jeremiah 51, verse 25. And here, through Jeremiah, the Lord says, "Behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain, who destroys the whole earth, declares the Lord, and I will stretch out my hand against you and roll you down from the crags, and I will make you a burnt out mountain." Obviously, this is something, if you try and think about this literally, it's not going to happen. He's talking about a power, a nation, if you will, a symbol of power. And of course, Zechariah 4:7, we saw this not too long ago when we talked about a mountain being an obstacle in front of Zerubbabel. And that was in chapter 4 and verse 7. Chapter 4 and verse 7. And the question was posed, "What are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become a plain, and he will bring forth a top stone with shouts of grace, grace to it." So the things that got in the way, the trouble with the neighbors, the government, and of course there were people in the remnant that were there that returned from Babylon that were, giving Zerubbabel and some of his people, they were saying, "Well, your work's just not up to standards, buddy. You need to clean up things here. This isn't anything like the first temple. We were there. We saw it. We saw it." But, they didn't have, 180,000 workers like Solomon had whenever he was building the temple. They had 50,000, and a lot of them were priests. They had a lot of good supervisors, not, too many chiefs and not enough Indians. But Zerubbabel was chosen by the Lord to complete that task. Point C, mountains are also associated with spiritual events. Now, if we look back to Deuteronomy, and of course there's all kinds of spiritual events that we could talk about, that mountains are in the forefront, if you will. Deuteronomy 11:29. And here Moses tells the people, "It shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to possess it, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal." You see, and he had the people line up, some on Ebal and some on Gerizim. And they shouted back and forth, the blessings and the curses. Something that was done. It was a big spiritual event to remind the people of the Lord's words and what could happen. Also, we look at Joshua chapter 8 and verse 33. Joshua chapter 8, verse 33, "All Israel with their elders and officers and their judges were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carry the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as the native. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had given command at first to bless the people of Israel." So it was said, it was commanded back in Deuteronomy. And whenever they came into the land under Joshua, it actually happened. Point D, mountains are seen as the home of the Lord. Mountains are seen as the home of the Lord. Back to the Psalm, Psalm 48 and verse 2. Psalm 48 and verse 2. And this is one of those ones, this is a psalm of the sons of Korah. Psalm 48 verse 2. And here they say, "Beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great King." Well, there's no greater king than the Lord himself. Also, Psalm 68:16. And this is a Psalm of David, Psalm 68:16. And here he says, "Why do you look with envy, O mountains with many peaks, at the mountain which God has desired for his abode? Surely the Lord will dwell there forever." Talking about Mount Zion, the home of the Lord. Point 30, nevertheless, instead of communicating the direction, destination, or mission of these four chariots, Zechariah described the two mountains that he had seen as mountains of bronze. Mountains of bronze. And of course, when we think about this, and we consider mountains of bronze, these are actual pictures taken in Israel in some locations out in the desert, specifically the one on the upper left of the screen right there. You get out in there and there's desert areas out in the Judean desert, and they actually have some mountains that are bronze in color. Something that would be a sight to see. And I know even here in the United States there's a lot of places you can go and see mountains, and it's breathtaking when you see it. When you see the majesty of God, the things that he's created, it's just breathtaking. Grand Canyon, all kinds of stuff. I know I've made a few trips to what they call the Enchanted Circle in northern New Mexico. About 9.5, 10-hour drive from here, something like that. And when I've gone that way, I usually go out I-40 for quite a ways and go into New Mexico near Raton. And by that time, you're in the Kit Carson National Forest, and you turn south a ways. And of course, if you look along the road a little ways, you're going to see antelope, you'll see bison, all kinds of wildlife. And then you drive through an area, and before long, you start to see, it's kind of like steep cliffs where they've cut out a road on either side. And of course, it's kind of windy through there. I kind of like performance driving. I kind of like to, go, speed up and go through some different areas and things like that. And then you'll see creeks and deer and all kinds of things. And then eventually the cliffs disappear and you don't really realize it, but you're actually going up. You're going upward in elevation. And then you make a sweeping turn to the south, and then you come back to the right, and boom, there it is. A huge valley. And you see the Rocky Mountains on the west side. And you're in Eagle's Nest, New Mexico. And of course there's Taos and Red River, Angel Fire, all these resort towns for skiers. And then in the valley, down in the valley, they have the Vietnam National Memorial. And of course, almost anywhere you stay there, unless you stay down in the valley, you have to stay in the mountains somewhere, and you're going to be up there about 8,000 feet or higher. You go to Red River and you stay in Red River, it's about 10,000 feet. So, and if you have altitude sickness, you probably don't want to go there. So, anyway, just a slight public service announcement, no extra charge. Point 31, the English word bronze appears in the Old Testament 153 times, beginning in the Genesis account concerning the descendant of Cain, a craftsman who forged agricultural tools from raw materials. Yeah, that's right. This guy, he was that guy, a descendant of Cain, who we know was kicked out and went to the land of Nod. And we see this in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 22. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 22. And of course there's this guy, Lamech, who had these wives. And he says, as for Zillah, she also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Well, I'll tell you, that's one of the things when you talk about somebody that is a forger. Well, they heat or melt metal up and they shape it. It's something that can be done. I've done that myself. sometimes in the past, things that I've had to do in order to possibly make parts or whatever the case was, or to repair something. Point 32, because bronze, it is a light metal alloy. Bronze has good tensile strength and can be used in art, architecture, and construction. And when corrosion occurs, it can be melted down, refined, and recycled. Well, let's look at Malachi chapter 3 and verse 3. Malachi chapter 3 and verse 3. And here, I don't know what I've got going up there. Okay. Talking about a certain person that's going to, do this thing in the future. He will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness. And here he tells us that the priesthood, they're going to have to be cleaned up, because at that particular time, their offerings were unrighteous. So there was some work to be done on the priesthood in Malachi's time. Point 33, more than half of the uses of the noun nekosheth, that is bronze, translates to bronze, appear in Old Testament passages about materials used in the construction of the tabernacle and also for the temple and some of its furnishings. Now we go back to Exodus chapter 25. Exodus chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. And of course there's a lot more you can read about. But then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the sons of Israel to raise a contribution for me. From every man whose heart moves him, you shall raise my contribution. This is the contribution which are you to raise from them: gold, silver, and bronze." Gold, silver, and bronze. And of course, bronze is an alloy. That's something, we've talked about a little bit. And it's something that's made from the combination of copper and tin. Also, looking at chapter 38, verses 29 through 31. Chapter 38, verses 29 through 31. And here's what they used by weight, if you will. The bronze of the wave offering was 70 talents and 2,400 shekels. 70 talents, a talent, depending on your source of information, a talent is about 75 pounds. So you're talking a lot of bronze. A lot of bronze was used there. And of course, he said with it, he made the sockets of the doorway of the tent of meeting, and the bronze altar and its bronze grating, and all the utensils of the altar, and the sockets of the court all around, and the sockets of the gate of the court, and all the pegs of the tabernacle, and all the pegs of the court all around. A lot of uses there with the tabernacle. And of course, talking about the temple, 1 Kings chapter 7. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 13 through 16. First Kings 7:13. Now King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was a widow's son from the tribe of Naphtali. Here you got a Jew living in Tyre. And he was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill for doing any work in bronze. So he came to King Solomon and performed all his work. He says he fashioned 2 pillars of bronze, 8 cubits, was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured the circumference of both of them. These were big pillars, heavy-duty pillars, if you will. Well, he also, it says, made 2 capitals of molten bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The height of one of the capitals was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. So these are huge pillars. They've got huge capitals on them, all made of bronze. And we can roll down to verses 27 through 30, same chapter. And here it says, then he made the 10 stands of bronze. The length of each was 4 cubits, and its width 4 cubits, and its height 3 cubits. And this was the design of the stands. They had borders, even borders between the frames. And on the borders, which were between the frames, were lions, oxen, and cherubim. And on the frames, there was a pedestal above. And beneath the lions and oxen were wreaths of hanging work. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. He said, now each stand had 4 bronze wheels with bronze axles, and its 4 feet and supports beneath the basin were cast supports with wreaths at each side. Wreaths at each side. So these are very ornate. And obviously this guy knew what cherubim looked like. Do we even know what cherubim looked like? Well, we kind of have an idea of what they looked like based on what we're told in Exodus and some of the other passages in the Bible. Also, verse 38, same chapter. And here it says, he made 10 basins of bronze. One basin held 40 baths. Each basin was 4 cubits, and on each of the 10 stands was one basin. And if you got a basin that held 40 baths, well, it's a basin you could take a bath in. Let's put it that way. Pretty good size. On down to verse 45. And the pails and the shovels and the bowls, even all these utensils which Hiram made for King Solomon in the house of the Lord, were of polished bronze. Polished bronze. In verse 47 it says, Solomon left all the utensils unweighed because there were too many. The weight of the bronze could not be ascertained. Now they started off, with a large amount of bronze. But by the time he got done, they had no idea what the weight was that was involved in this. But you see, in that day and time, bronze was something of value. Notice when they took up the collection in the wilderness, where'd they get the gold, the silver, and the bronze? Well, they brought it from Egypt. Yeah. Well, we could go on, but we won't go on any further with that. Point 34, Moses' description of the promised land included an abundant supply of water, grains, fruit, honey, plenty of food products, and some ore that could be mined and processed into raw materials and finished goods. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Verses 7 through 9. And here Moses says, for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing forth in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive oil, and honey, a land where you will eat food without scarcity, in which you will not lack anything, a land whose stones are ironed, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. That's right, out of the hills in the promised land, they could dig copper ore, if you will, copper ore. Quite a land they were inheriting from the Canaanites, the promised land. Of course, they had to take it by force. Point 35, the Hebrew noun Nekosheth is translated bronze in our verse, but is also used in the Old Testament as a common word for copper, which combined or smelted with tin forms the metal alloy known as bronze. Now you have to imagine, what it's like if you're going to smelt something like that, and you just don't hold a match under it and wait for it to get hot enough. That's not going to happen. Now, one of my great uncles on my dad's side of the family, after World War II, he was in the Army Air Corps, and he came home to Butler County in Pennsylvania, and he found a job in Elwood City, Pennsylvania. And he worked in the steel mills there for years. And he was involved in smelting and all kinds of other stuff. And there was times that he got burned. But most of the time, they had on the proper protective equipment, and they were able to avoid being injured. But, he's one of these guys that he always, because of the equipment, we see his body was in a heated state. And of course, sometimes, he would be in the area where they had the furnaces and stuff, and he didn't have to have his helmet and eye protection and things on to cover his face and stuff. Well, every time you'd see him, his face looked red because from the heat. And there was, if you will, it was kind of a light burn, if you will. But, that was back in the day, before all the stuff happened, and Bruce Springsteen came on the scene to sing all the songs about people that were out of work because the steel mills closed. Well, anyway, with that note, let's stop right there, and we'll take a break and come back and continue our study of Zechariah.